He was the kind of man people passed on the street without a second glance. An old man with slow steps and a quiet gaze, living alone in a house that had seen better decades, in a neighborhood where people no longer asked names, just waved from their porches and carried on. And if anyone did remember him, they might have said he was a widower, maybe a veteran, maybe just another man outliving his time. But they would have been wrong, because beneath that weathered skin and behind those calm eyes was a soldier forged in the frozen forests of Europe, a man who had once stared down death and walked away with nothing but a rifle and a promise to never be caught unprepared again. His name was Frank Delaney, and on a cold night in late August, 3 young men broke into his home expecting money or medicine, or maybe just something easy and fast. They didn't know who lived there, and they didn't care, because to them he was just another old man, someone to push past someone who couldn't, possibly fight back. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Frank had spent a lifetime waiting for moments like this, not out of paranoia or fear, but out of memory, out of instinct, because some things never leave a man. No matter how many years pass, what happened inside that house would never make the headlines the way it should, and the truth of that night would never fully be told. But by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why one man stood still while 3 others lost control, and you'll see why, even at 92, Frank Delaney remained the most dangerous kind of quiet. This is not just a story, it's a warning, and it begins now, on the edge of a quiet American town where time moved. Slower, and neighbors still waved from across cracked fences, stood an old house weathered by seasons and silence, surrounded by overgrown shrubs and peeling paint, but stubbornly upright, as if it refused to bow to the years, much like the man who lived inside it. His name was Frank Delaney, a name that once carried weight on the European front lines, but now only echoed softly in his own head, like a distant drumbeat from a war no one talked about anymore. At 92, Frank moved with the rhythm of someone who had earned every scar on his hands and every ache in his joints, waking each morning before the sun to make black coffee strong enough to strip paint, and sitting at the kitchen table where dust settled like snow across forgotten medals and folded letters from men who never came home. He wasn't the type to speak of glory or loss, not even to the faded photograph of his late wife Evelyn that still rested on the mantel, watching him with the same gentle defiance she had in life. And though his neighbors often forgot he was even there, Frank never forgot who he was or what he had once done, because the war might have ended in history books and documentaries, but for him it had never truly stopped. It had only gone quiet, like the woods before an ambush. And in that silence, Frank kept his habits sharp, like the way he checked the locks every night, or how he still cleaned his old Colt 1911 every Sunday, not out of fear or paranoia, but out of discipline, the kind drilled into a young soldier's spine when failure meant watching a friend bleed out in the mud while artillery shook the sky. That night the sky had no stars, only clouds, low and heavy, like the breath before a storm, and Frank had just finished washing the few dishes he used when a strange feeling crawled up his back. Not panic, not dread, but a cold sense of calculation. The same kind he'd felt crouched behind rubble in Bastogne, waiting for the enemy to make the first move. He turned off the kitchen light and stood there, listening. The silence stretched thin until he heard it, a soft crunch of gravel outside, too slow for a passing animal, too deliberate for the wind, and in that moment Frank didn't hesitate. He moved like muscle memory, pulling the pistol from its drawer and slipping into the shadow between the hallway and living room, where he had a clear view of the front door, just in time to see the handle twist slowly, then jerk violently. The door burst inward, and a figure stepped in, dark clothes, black mask, clutching something metallic like a crowbar. But he barely had time to breathe before Frank squeezed the trigger once, and the blast echoed through the house as the man collapsed backward, gasping as he hit the floor, his breath loud and ragged, one hand clutching his chest, red already soaking through the fabric, and Frank didn't flinch, he didn't blink. He stepped forward and saw the second man behind the first wide-eyed frozen, as if he had just seen a ghost. And in a way, maybe he had. Because Frank wasn't just an old man defending his home. He was something older and deeper, a force carved out by fire and loss, and long nights under mortar fire. The second man bolted, turned, and ran so fast he nearly fell over the railing and vanished into the dark, leaving only the third figure still outside, unsure whether to flee or finish what they started. Frank didn't speak. He didn't shout warnings or threats. He simply stared at the shape outside. Through the broken doorway, pistol steady, breathing calm, not a hint of tremor in his fingers. And for a moment there was a standoff, the kind not taught in schools or rehearsed in movies, but known only to men who had looked death in the eye and kept walking. Then the third man ran, leaving behind only the injured one still wheezing on the floor, and the distant sound of tires screeching as a car peeled away down the road. Frank looked down at the intruder not with hatred or satisfaction, but with a hollow kind of sorrow because he had never wanted to shoot again, not outside the battlefield, and especially not inside his own home. But when the moment came, he didn't think, he simply acted as he was trained to do all those years. Agoa set the gun on the counter and walked slowly to the phone. His legs steady, his heart firm, and dialed the police with a voice so calm the dispatcher asked twice if he was safe. He gave them the address, explained that one was injured, the others had fled, and then hung up without another word, walking back to the living room and sitting in his old recliner, where his body finally began to feel the weight of 92 years again, his hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the broken door, as memories began to swirl not just of the war, but of every face he'd ever seen go pale with fear, of every moment he'd been forced to choose between waiting and reacting, and every time he had pulled the trigger and lived to remember what came after. When the police arrived, lights flashing, voices raised, they found Frank sitting quietly unshaken, surrounded by silence and the faint smell of gunpowder. The officer asked if he was all right, and Frank only nodded, saying he didn't much care for being interrupted. After dinner, they found the injured man still alive, barely bleeding heavily, and Frank gave them every detail they needed with the precision of a field report, concise, accurate, unemotional. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, but he didn't regret it either, because he knew in the deepest part of himself that the world wasn't as safe as people like to believe, and sometimes it still demanded old men to stand up when no one else would. Frank Delaney had never expected to be in the center of a crime scene again, but as paramedics lifted the injured man from his floor and officers walked through his home asking questions with hushed urgency, he found himself standing still in the middle of it all, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as something in between. He watched one of the younger officers step carefully over the shattered pieces of his front door, and for a moment Frank was taken back to Belgium, where rubble and bodies had been all that remained after an artillery strike. The shapes different, the silence familiar, and he couldn't help but feel the sharp weight of memory pressing against his chest, not out of fear but of clarity, because this kind of chaos was not new to him. It was simply wearing a modern disguise. Inside the squad car parked outside the house, the third intruder who had fled earlier had been caught down the street, shaken and pale with grass stains on his jeans and panic thick in his voice. When questioned by officers, he had rambled about an old man with dead eyes who didn't hesitate, who didn't shout warnings, who just stood there like something out of a nightmare. And when Frank overheard the description, he didn't react. His face remained still, but his hands clenched slightly because he knew exactly what those eyes had seen and what they were still carrying. And for the first time in years, he wondered whether those boys ever had a chance to become anything other than what they were tonight, desperate, reckless, dangerous, and completely unprepared for the consequences of crossing a man whose past was sharper than any weapon they had brought. The detectives came later dressed in suits that looked out of place. Against the backdrop of worn wallpaper and faded furniture, one of them, a woman in her 40s, spoke gently as she asked Frank to go over the events again, and he did without embellishment. His voice flat and firm, laying out the facts like coordinates on a map. Her eyes never left his face, and at one point she asked him if he had hesitated before pulling the trigger. And Frank looked at her without blinking and said only once when I was 20 and my best friend didn't come home with us after, that I learned that hesitation costs lives. She wrote something in her notebook, but didn't speak again for a long moment, and Frank appreciated the silence because it gave him room to breathe, to sit back in his chair and feel the ache in his knees rise like smoke from an old fire. The next morning, the media trucks came, and with them, the noise returned. Lights flashing, reporters trying to get quotes from neighbors who hadn't spoken to Frank in months, but now called him a local legend, a hero. A reminder that real men still existed. And while some of them meant well, Frank knew most of them were just chasing the scent of blood and drama, and so he refused to talk to any of them. He stayed inside his house, watching through the curtains. With a slow sip of coffee, listening to the low rumble of voices outside describing a story they didn't understand and never would, because to them it was just headlines and ratings. But to Frank, it was another night in a lifetime of nights that never truly ended. When the news reached the veterans community, a few old friends reached out calls from men whose names he hadn't heard in decades, voices slower but still solid. One in particular came from a man named Charles, who had fought. Beside him, in 1945 and now lived 3 states away, Charles's voice cracked slightly when he said, "I knew you still had it in you." Frankie and Frank laughed for the first time in days, a real deep laugh that carried something warmer than relief, something closer to pride. But even then, he couldn't shake the weight in his chest. Not guilt exactly, but the recognition that even now the world still had use for old soldiers, that even now men like him were being tested, and that somewhere in the quiet between all the noise there was still a war being fought, just in a different form. Later that week, after the dust had settled somewhat, an officer returned to take a final statement, and as they stood together on the porch, the officer, young, barely 30, asked Frank if he ever regretted keeping the pistol loaded all these years. Frank looked out toward the yard where the grass had started to grow over the footprints left by the fleeing men, and he said no, because regret doesn't. Stop bullets and unpreparedness doesn't bring peace, if anything. I regret not having reinforced the door. The officer nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond, and Frank didn't expect him to, because there was a gulf of experience between them that words could not bridge, and he knew that trying to explain what it meant to live with ghosts would only make the boy more uncomfortable. So he changed the subject to the weather, and they spoke for a moment like strangers pretending to be neighbors, before the officer left with a handshake that was too soft for Frank to feel. That night, Frank sat by the window again, lights off, curtains drawn slightly open, and his Colt resting unloaded on the table beside him, not out of paranoia, but habit, a routine that brought order to the silence. He could hear the wind in the trees, the faint hum of a television down the block, and in between those sounds he heard nothing. And it was the nothing that kept him alert, because peace was never silent. Not truly. Not for men who had seen what he had seen. It was simply the pause between storms, a calm too perfect to trust. And yet he wasn't afraid, he was tired. Yes, but not afraid. And as he sat there watching shadows move across the street, he thought of the boy he'd shot and wondered if the wound would be a turning point or an ending, and if someday that young man might look back and remember the cold eyes of an old man who had once been 20 with dirt on his boots and fear in his stomach and a rifle in his hand. Frank didn't believe in second chances as a rule, but he believed in warnings, and he hoped somewhere deep inside that what happened that night might serve as a sharp enough lesson to change at least one life. Because if it didn't, then the shot had been wasted, and Frank had never once wasted a bullet, not in France, not in Belgium, and not on his own living room floor. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening, breathing, letting the darkness sit with him, like an old comrade, and when he finally stood to turn off the porch light, he did so slowly, deliberately, as if saluting a memory that had just walked out the front door without saying goodbye. Days passed, but the rhythm of Frank Delaney's life remained, unchanged, at least on the surface, because while the coffee still brewed at 5 sharp and the front porch light was turned off each night with the same firm hand, something in the air around him had shifted subtly, like the scent before a coming. Storm, the neighbors who once barely acknowledged him, now offered waves from across the street, and a few even brought food wrapped in foil with nervous smiles and awkward words of appreciation, as if casseroles could substitute for understanding. Frank accepted the gestures with polite nods and quiet thanks, but deep inside he remained distant. Not out of pride, but out of a knowledge that no one bringing lasagna truly understood what it meant to fire a weapon in your own home, not in defense of a country or a flag, but in defense of silence, of stillness, of the kind of peace that only men who had survived real chaos could ever recognize as sacred. One afternoon he stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out an old mug when the phone rang, and he almost didn't answer it because he had grown tired of voices asking how he felt or what he had learned from the experience, or if he had any words for young people about courage and preparedness, as if violence was a parable to be taught rather than a weight to be carried, but something in the tone of the ringing felt different, and when he picked up the receiver, the voice on the other end was soft, hesitant, young, but shaken. The boy introduced himself as Matthew and said that he was the one who had run, the one who didn't make it inside the house, the one who saw what happened and fled into the night. And Frank remained silent for several seconds, not because he didn't know what to say, but because so many things came to mind at once that none of them seemed right, and when he finally spoke, he said only, "Why are you calling me?" And the boy answered, "Because I can't sleep," and I thought, maybe you couldn't either. Frank listened closely, not just to the words, but to the space between them, to the breath that wavered, and the voice that cracked, and he recognized something there. Not remorse exactly, but fear. Real fear. The kind that lingers after adrenaline fades and reality sharpens into something cold and unrelenting. Matthew said he hadn't known what they were getting into, that it was supposed to be quick, a scare, a stupid mistake, and that he hadn't even brought a weapon. And when Frank asked what he had planned to do if things had gone differently, the boy didn't answer because there was no answer that wouldn't sound foolish or cowardly or both. And Frank could feel the weight of that silence like a stone pressed against his chest. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse the boy or call him a criminal. He simply told him that stupid mistakes cost lives, and that in another life, in another time, he had seen men die for less, and that if the boy truly wanted to change, if he wasn't just afraid, but actually willing to walk a different road, then he had better start walking right now. Not tomorrow, not next week, not after some program or apology, but immediately. Because the world didn't wait for redemption, and second chances weren't owed, they were earned. And then he said something that surprised even himself. He told Matthew to meet him at the Veterans Hall that Saturday morning and hung up without waiting for a response. Saturday came gray and cool with a mist hanging over the lawn like breath held in suspense. And Frank arrived early, sitting in his truck outside the building, watching the door and half expecting no one to show, but at exactly 8:13, the boy arrived, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight, eyes downcast. And Frank watched him for a moment before stepping out of the truck and leading him inside without a word. The hall smelled of old wood and coffee and memory, and Frank introduced him to the few veterans who still gathered there once a week to talk about nothing and everything. And for the first few hours, Matthew said little. He just listened wide-eyed as the men told stories that sounded like fiction, but carried the weight of truth, and every now and then he would glance at Frank as if to check whether this was some sort of punishment. But Frank only nodded slightly as if to say, This is where it starts. Over the following weeks, Matthew kept coming. Sometimes he asked questions. Sometimes he swept the floor or cleaned the coffee urns without being asked. And Frank watched quietly, never praising, never criticizing, just observing and listening. And over time, he began to see the edges of something new in the boy. Not transformation. Not yet, but the first signs of discipline, the beginnings of self-awareness. And one afternoon, as they sat on the back steps of the hall, Matthew asked him why he had taken the shot, why he hadn't just yelled or waited or let the police handle it, and Frank told him that war teaches a man to recognize moments that matter and to act not out of fear or rage, but clarity. And when you've spent your life surviving by being ready, you don't unlearn that just because you're old. You don't stop defending your space just because others expect you to go quietly. That night, Frank sat by the window again. The Colt was locked away now. Not because he didn't trust the world, but because he had seen something shift, however slightly, and for the first time. In a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe one bullet could do more than stop a threat. Maybe it could change a direction. Maybe it could echo forward, not as violence, but as warning. And that thought stayed with him, not as comfort, but as a kind of quiet endurance, the same kind that had carried him through cold trenches and empty rooms and sleepless nights. And as the street outside darkened and the wind stirred the leaves into whispers, Frank closed his eyes and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety exactly, but purpose. The sense that even at 92, even after all he had lost and all he had carried, there was still something in him worth waking up for. The seasons began to change around Frank Delaney, though he barely noticed the shift in the color of the leaves or the subtle drop in temperature, because much of his attention remained inward, where the events of that August night still echoed through his thoughts like faint gunfire in the distance, the kind you can't quite locate but always feel in your chest. He moved through his days with the same quiet discipline that had shaped his entire adult life, rising early, maintaining the same routines, making the same simple meals, and yet there was something new beneath it all, something he couldn't quite name, but that pressed against his awareness like a message just out of reach. And it wasn't just the memory of pulling the trigger or the sound of that young man collapsing onto his floor. It was the realization that his story, which he had assumed would end quietly, had suddenly found a new page turned without his permission. He found himself watching people differently, not with suspicion, but with a deeper sense of presence. When he walked to the hardware store or sat at the bench outside the post office, he began to notice how fast people moved, how much they looked at their phones, how little they seemed to understand about the fragility of peace. And he didn't blame them, not really, because most of them had never needed to carry a weapon for more than sport or stand between danger and the people they loved, but still, he felt a widening gap between the world he remembered and the one he now lived in and for. The first time since his wife passed, he wondered if maybe there was still something he was meant to do, something more than just exist in the quiet spaces between the past and whatever remained of the future. When Matthew returned to the Veterans Hall for the fourth week in a row, Frank handed him a broom without speaking, and the boy took it without question, sweeping the same floor that generations of soldiers had walked across. And as the dust gathered in small piles along the baseboards, Frank began to talk not about war or heroism or the shot that changed both their lives, but about routine, about how the smallest habits could build the strongest walls, about how discipline wasn't about control, but about respect for yourself and others. And Matthew listened, not like a student in a classroom, but like a man hearing something he had always needed but never found, and in that simple exchange something shifted between them. Not into friendship exactly, but into a mutual recognition that sometimes change comes not in storms, but in steady rain. Later that day, they sat outside the hall on a wooden bench worn smooth by weather and time, and Matthew asked Frank if he had ever Been afraid when he was young, and Frank answered without hesitation every single day, and when Matthew asked how he kept going, Frank told him that fear was not the enemy, but the signal that you were still alive, and still had something left to protect. He told the boy that courage wasn't about the absence of fear, but about walking forward anyway. And Matthew nodded slowly, as if those words were landing somewhere deep behind his ribs, where his doubt had taken root. And Frank saw in that gesture a reflection of the boys he had once led through frozen forests and muddy ditches, some of whom never came home, but all of whom had looked at him the same way in moments of quiet. Before the battle began, as October wore on, the town began to whisper less about the shooting and more about the old man who had survived it, about the veteran who still kept his lawn trimmed and his porch swept, and who now spoke to the boy who had once run from his doorstep, as if they had known each other for years. And Frank neither encouraged nor discouraged the attention, because he knew how quickly public opinion shifted and how little it ultimately mattered to the truth of a man's life. But privately, he allowed himself a kind of cautious hope, not for recognition or legacy, but for the simple fact that maybe what had happened in his home had not only ended one kind of danger, but sparked the beginning of something better, not just for Matthew, but for himself. One morning, Frank opened the mailbox and found a letter addressed by hand with no return address. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper written in uneven lines that read, "I was the one you shot. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because the doctors say I'll walk again, and that should feel like good news, but it doesn't, not really. Because I keep thinking about that night and how close I came to never seeing anything again, and how it wasn't your face. I saw when I closed my eyes, but mine. And I don't know what that means or what I'm supposed to do next. But I guess I wanted you to know that I get it now, and maybe that matters or maybe it doesn't. I don't know." Frank read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it in the same drawer where he kept his service medals and the photo of his platoon taken just days before the end of the war, and he sat down in his chair without speaking, letting the weight of the letter settle into his chest, not as guilt or relief but as truth. Because some wounds didn't bleed and some apologies didn't come with answers. And that was all right, because life was not a clean story. It was a long walk through uneven ground, and every step mattered, even if you didn't know where it would take you. That evening, he opened the front door and stepped onto his porch, breathing in the cool air and watching the light fade across the rooftops of houses that had all stood longer than most of the people who lived in them. And for a long time, he just stood, their hands in his pockets, heart steady, mind quiet. And as the first stars blinked into view, he whispered something to himself, something no one else would hear, and that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be real, because in that moment, he understood that what had begun as an act of survival had become something else entirely. A reminder that no matter how far a man travels from the battlefield, there is always a part of him still standing. Watch Frank Delaney never considered himself a teacher, and certainly not a mentor, but over the next few months, something began to take shape between him and the boy who had once stood frozen outside his home, heart-racing, hands trembling, unsure whether to flee or follow through with a plan that could have ended much worse. Now Matthew showed up early, most mornings, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with questions, and Frank found himself responding not with lectures or speeches, but with the same kind of quiet structure that had kept him alive. Long after his uniform had been folded and stored away, he showed the boy how to sand wood without rushing, how to keep a lawn in order, how to clean a rifle, not for show but for function. And through these tasks came conversations not grand or philosophical, but slow and steady, like the turning of a wheel built on shared silence and reluctant trust. The others at the Veterans Hall noticed the change not just in Matthew, but in Frank, who now stayed a little longer after meetings, who no longer sat in the corner lost in memory, but occasionally shared one of his own stories, the kind that did not begin with glory or end in triumph, but lived in the middle ground where fear and duty collided in the cold mud of history, one day one of the older vets, a man named Bill who had served in Korea, leaned toward Frank after the boy left and said, "Never thought I'd see the day you let someone in again." Frank didn't answer, just stared out the window at the fading light and thought about the way. Some doors didn't creak when they opened again, they just silently swung free like they'd been waiting. One evening after the sun had slipped beneath the hills and the town had quieted into its usual rhythm of distant televisions and porch, lights glowing like watchful eyes, Frank sat in his living room with a letter in his lap. It was from the district attorney's office, addressed formally and stamped with the cold assurance of official judgment. It stated that no charges would be filed, that the use of force had been deemed justified, that the investigation was closed, and the case considered resolved. Frank stared at those words for a long time, not because he was surprised, but because of how final they sounded, how clinical and tidy and far removed from the weight of what had actually happened, because nothing about that night felt resolved to him. Not the blood on his floor, not the way he still listened too closely to every creak in the house, and certainly not the knowledge that one man still carried a bullet wound because of what Frank had done. He folded the letter carefully and set it aside, then walked into the hallway where the picture of Evelyn still hung, her smile soft and knowing, and for a moment he wondered what she would have thought of all this, whether she would have called it necessary or tragic or both. And he felt her absence not as a sharp stab, but as a long, slow ache, the kind that lived in his bones and echoed in the quiet moments. Before sleep, the kind that didn't fade with noise or time. He sat beneath that picture for a while longer than usual, hands resting on his knees, back straight, as if still waiting for orders. Then eventually stood and walked outside into the darkness, letting the night air carry away some of what remained heavy in him. There was a stillness in the air that evening, one that reminded Frank of moments between battles when no one spoke, because words had no weight and only the breath of the earth. Reminded you that life was still choosing to move forward. He walked the perimeter of his yard, slowly, methodically, like he had done thousands of times before, checking the fence, the gate, the way the moonlight spilled across the grass as if searching for footprints that might have returned, though he knew they hadn't. It wasn't about caution anymore. It was about habit, about memory, and about a ritual that kept the ghosts quiet a little longer. In the following weeks, Matthew began asking harder questions about war, about what it meant to carry memories you couldn't share with people who hadn't been there. And Frank answered as best he could, though often he said less than he knew, not because he didn't trust the boy, but because some truths were carved too deep to be spoken aloud. He told Matthew that the worst part of combat wasn't the danger or the chaos, but the moments after, when your heart was still pounding and you realized you were the one who got to keep going. That kind of survival wasn't clean. It didn't feel like winning it. Just felt like more time to carry the names of the ones who didn't one morning. Matthew showed up with a file folder in his hand and said he had enrolled in the local community college. He didn't say it was because of Frank, but Frank knew and nodded once without saying anything, proud in a way that didn't need to be expressed. And when the boy left that afternoon, Frank sat in his chair and stared at the door. Not because he expected anyone to come through it, but because it reminded him that sometimes even the smallest choices can lead a person out of the dark and into something better. And he wondered how different his life might have been if someone like him had been waiting at the edge of his worst decisions all those years ago. The final piece of the story came one quiet Sunday morning when Frank received a package wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside was a book, a worn military memoir, and a short note that simply read, "Thank you for stopping me before I became someone I couldn't recognize." Frank held the book in his hands for a long time, then set it beside the photo of his wife, and finally allowed himself a long, deep breath, not of relief, but of release, not because the past had let go of him, but because he had chosen to stop clenching it so tightly. as fall turned to winter and the first snow began to dust the rooftops of the town. Frank continued his routines, but something had softened in him, a quiet shift, like a soldier finally stepping away from the front lines, not to forget, but to rest. And as he stood on his porch watching the world turn slowly beneath the gray sky, he knew that no matter how long he had left, it would be enough, because somewhere in the midst of an ordinary life, an extraordinary moment had found him and given him one last mission to remind one boy, and maybe a few others, that the most powerful kind of strength is the one that chooses to stand still in the chaos and listen before it acts. In the end, it wasn't the bullet that changed everything. It was the silence that followed, the kind that doesn't echo, but settles deep into the bones of a man who thought his story had already ended. Frank Delaney didn't go looking for redemption, nor did he ask to become anyone's turning point. But sometimes, life doesn't ask permission. It simply places the mission in front of you one last time. What happened that night was more than self-defense. It was a reminder that discipline never dies, that honor doesn't retire, and that even in the quiet corners of a forgotten town, the weight of duty still finds a place to land. Frank stood his ground not out of anger, but because that's what soldiers do. They protect, they endure, and sometimes they teach without saying a word. As the snow settled on the rooftops and the town slowly returned to its rhythm, Frank's story became something more than headlines. It became a lesson, a whisper to a younger generation. That courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the man who never brags, the one who watches, the one who acts only when necessary, and then sits in the dark, holding the cost of that decision in silence. So if this story stayed with you, maybe it's because deep down, we all hope there's still a Frank Delaney out there, quiet, ready, and willing to stand when no one else will. Subscribe for more stories that could have been real.